Hi, I'm Alex Green-Higgy, and welcome to Our Heritage. The struggle for women's rights and freedoms is a pivotal but underrepresented aspect of modern history. It's still going on alongside struggles against challenges like mental illness and addiction. Owen Sound City Councillor Colleen Purden has been involved in the work against these issues for almost 30 years in Grey County. It's a story with some great successes, but still a great deal more to be done. I'll warn anyone watching right now, especially if you're a survivor, that some of the stuff we talk about may be a little unsettling, but I hope that you'll stay with us, especially if you think that you or someone you know is going through problems like addiction, mental illness, or domestic violence, because at the end of the program, I'll ask Colleen to take us through a number of the places that you can go to get help. So with that in mind, let's get rolling. Colleen, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you, Alex. It's great.
So you have had a very intriguing background that you brought when you first arrived in Owen Sound. In what year was it?
Well, I came here in 1986. When you said 30 years, I thought, wow, that makes you feel old.
Well, I was born in 1986, so I know exactly how long it's been. It's very nearly there. So. Where did you come from?
Well, my journey to Owen Sound was really kind of an interesting path. I came to work. I was hired as the executive director of the Women's Center. It was a shelter, a 10-bed shelter. And before that, I had been working in the areas of addictions and mental health. And I was a music therapist. I'd been working for 7 years before I came to Owen Sound in Germany as a music therapist, and met my husband there, had several children there, and then decided that I wanted to come back to Canada, and he was okay with that idea. So we all came back, and then it was very difficult for both of us, our music therapists, to get work. So I took this job at the Women's Center. I was intrigued, but I really didn't know a great deal about woman abuse or violence against women. That was not my field.
I see. And when you were, where was the Women's Center when you arrived there?
Well, when I arrived, the Women's Center was located where the OSCVI High School was, where a very nice subdivision is right now, and the Board of Education had actually given us that house. It was a small brick house for $1 a year. So we were there, but I tell you, it was a 10-bed shelter for women, and we were stuffed in there like sardines. It was the tiniest little place. So when women who were abused were looking for shelter, they often had to share a room with a total stranger with their children. And my office was in the basement. It wasn't high enough for me to stand up, so you spent a lot of time going to creak. It wasn't a great facility, but it was a really important place for many women.
Mm-hmm. And for you, a bit of a learning curve then.
A big learning curve, but you know, a lot of us were at the front end of a learning curve in 1986. The shelter existed because a group of women in the area decided they wanted to do something about violence against women and wanted to have a safe place. And they were just volunteers. They just got together, some women from the Women's Institute, some women in the community. They got together, they raised money, and they started off in an apartment building with a couple of bedrooms. I think they had a 4-bedroom apartment building up on 9th Avenue. And then from there they got this building from the Board of Education that basically it was a surplus building that they had. Moved in there, and I started in '86, and the whole organization had only been going for about 4 years, and had kind of had a little bit of money there so we could have a few kind of quote professional staff working there, but kind of a community response to domestic violence was pretty early days in Owen Sound and actually all across the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, and speaking of that, it's, as you say, early days, and yet it's shocking that well, I suppose it's a matter of perspective that 86 wasn't so very long ago.
No.
And so I'm interested to know what were the challenges of advancing the facility. What were you working against?
Well, You know, it was interesting, the Women's Center and the establishment of a shelter for abused women was not actually well supported in the community. That's one of the biggest changes that I could say. Now, services like the Women's Center and Women's House, they're very well supported by the community. In fact, I think the local politicians of the day in Grey County, they didn't want a shelter. They thought it would be something that would be encouraging women to leave their husbands, and they didn't think that that was a good plan. So there was no support from the county at the time for the establishment of the women's shelter. There were a lot of myths about what abuse was and is. There was a lot of pressure on women to kind of suck it up, basically, or it's your bed, you lie in it. Those were the attitudes, and those types of attitudes they're still around, but they're not the way they were. They're not the dominant attitudes the way they were when the women in our community started the shelter.
And you say there are a lot of myths about abuse. Can you give me an idea of what some of those are?
Oh, the myths that, well, I shared as well. The biggest myth was it doesn't happen. So I had worked at that time for 10 years in mental health and addictions, and I had honestly never ever run across the issue of abuse. Occasionally in mental health services, you met somebody who had experienced sexual abuse. It was never talked about. It was never part of the mental health diagnosis. It was just one of those things that happened, you know, like a car accident. And in addiction services, there was never any discussion even about child abuse. It was just people had a diagnosis, they were depressed or they were addicted, and that's what you worked with. You didn't look at other things that were happening in their lives. So even though I was a professional, worked in a lot of very different fields, the whole issue of abuse had never really kind of, quote, come up. So I started working at a women's shelter, a 10-bed women's shelter that was absolutely full to the seams. The phone never quit ringing. We had a 24-hour crisis line, and it's still a service that's available. And I thought, first of all, where are they all coming from? And the second was, how did I miss this? Like, how could I have worked in the helping profession for so long and not seen and known this? And the other was, it made me stop, and I had to kind of go back and think of all those years I'd worked in those fields and rethink that. And then I had to rethink my own childhood and my own life, thinking, okay, and then you start thinking, oh right, I remember one of my teachers was an abused woman. She came to school covered in bruises, and I remember that, but I never thought of it. I didn't even really like her very much because she wasn't a very happy person. She was quite depressed, and everybody kind of ganged up on her as students. So it was like taking a veil, like lifting the veil in a way. So that's one of the myths, that it doesn't happen much, or it happens to other people, or it happens to poor people, or it happens to certain ethno or religious groups. It's out there in other places, but that was the biggest myth for me. It was everywhere I looked.
And we'll discuss where you went from having that veil removed and look back on that in a minute, and we're just going to take a quick break first. Colleen, you mentioned earlier that early days at the Women's Center, it had a lot of support from the local Women's Institute.
Yes.
So there's a longer tradition here with the Women's Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Oh, it was one of the nicest parts of working at the Women's Center. I used to go out and do speaking engagements, and some of our biggest supporters at the time were Women's Institutes all across Grey and Bruce. And so I would go to their meetings, and they were so amazing, because these women were talking about what it was like for them before there was such a thing as a shelter, how they helped one another, how happy they were to support a shelter because it was something that they knew was totally important for women to have a safe place to go to. And they talked about what it was like when no one believed what was happening in their family, that they were being assaulted or abused. Women just didn't seem to have a voice at that time, and it was seen as a woman's place to be at home and do what her husband told her to do, and if she was being abused, it was somehow her fault. She must have done something to deserve the abuse. And in fact, in Canadian law, it was actually, well, I never remember numbers, but for a long time, you were allowed to discipline your wife. The husband could discipline their wife, their servant, and their child. They then took out of the Canadian legislation the disciplining of the wife and the servant. So husbands and masters can no longer discipline their wife or their servant. But under Canadian law, you're still allowed to use physical force to discipline your child. That's still on the books in Canada. I can't believe that. But those were the kind of attitudes. So the Women's Institutes, they were wonderful supporters. They knit, they sewed, they brought in quilts, they raised money for the Women's Center, they shopped for us. They were amazing women. They
come from a wide range of backgrounds?
All kinds of backgrounds. A lot of farm women, but also, people who lived in villages and in Owen Sound. Almost every community had a Women's Institute.
And I remember reading about them. They go back quite a long way.
A long time, yeah. So there was this kind of women's network in a lot of ways, and it was so great and touching too to hear women's stories before the days of a shelter.
So they were glad to see that.
They were very glad and very supportive because they knew how important it was.
So you obviously came into this with your turn to take up the next wave of challenges, and it's nice to have that sense of being part of a succession, certainly.
Well, and it was I think the reason I got the job was because I had done a lot of project management and done a lot of new things, and they kind of liked that idea, I think, and we did a lot of new things then at the Women's Center. What
was the process from your point of view and from the Center's point of view, of changing some of these prevailing attitudes that still hadn't been sort of knocked over?
Well, I think the biggest one was just talk about it. So the myth is that it's not happening. The myth is somehow that it's women's fault, and it's covered and shrouded in silence. The whole issue. It's a very ugly part of our humanity, violence in intimate relationships. You're supposed to love and respect and care and support the person you live with. So when it's not like that, when there's abuse and controlling behavior and physical assaults, sexual assaults, it's a very kind of dirty secret in a lot of ways. So we I think, often say we have thousands of years of practice not talking about these things. So I think for us then, when I started working at the Women's Center and all the way through, we just need to develop a comfort level in talking about these things so that we can change them. Because until we can actually acknowledge the problems and talk about them, we can't change.
How did you go about doing that in the community?
Did a lot of speaking engagements, talked a lot. I mean, it was really interesting at the beginning. I started going to men's service groups at that time, the Rotary in Kiwanis. They were only for men.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Okay.
women weren't allowed. So there are a lot of good men in the community. So they were Rotarians or whatever, and they would invite me to come in to talk about violence against women. And so these men's service groups could also support the Women's Center, which many of them did. But that was not an easy gig. It really wasn't, because there were often men in the group who were hostile, actually, to the whole idea. Maybe they were abusive people themselves. Anyway, they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't like it. But I think that's really changed. Well, I think women are now allowed to be part of those service groups. There's very few gender-specific groups now. And there's an openness more about talking about abuse and violence. And the reality is that most of the men in this world are not abusing their partners. Most of them love their partners and care for them. But we live in a society where it's been easy for the perpetrators of abuse to hide or to blame or to minimize what's going on. And it's only recently, really, that even legal protections have been there for women.
Tell me about that. Were there important legal decisions that took place during your stint in Owens?
For sure. I mean, when I started working at the Women's Center, I was at 86, that's when the law changed. So up until that time, if I was assaulted by my husband, I had to lay a charge against him. If I was assaulted by a stranger in the street, the police laid a charge. So how much do you think a woman who's just been assaulted by a man wants to go to the police and say, I want a charge laid? I mean, it did happen, but most women were absolutely not interested in laying a charge against their own husband, because it's their charge then. Right. So they changed the law then, so they made it compulsory for police to treat an assault of an intimate partner the same way they'd treat any assault. You know, it didn't matter what the relationship was. What matters is there's an assault, and it might be a assault with bodily harm, or assault with a weapon. You know, there's all these different types of assaults. A sexual assault, it doesn't matter if you're married to the person. You can't sexually assault or assault with a weapon. It's the same. But that was a huge, huge change, and it took a lot of work with police then too, because the prevailing idea was violence in families was a private family matter. The best idea was just to leave it alone, and those guys will figure it out.
So it's changing the culture is maybe more significant than changing the law at times.
Well, it went both. We had that law because of the culture.
I see what you mean. Okay, yeah.
So then when the culture starts to shift, I mean, there was a lot of the big wave of feminism came along. Women's rights were very strong at the time, and that started to shift the laws as well. So, and that offered women more protections, although it's still not an easy thing. It is a family, and when the police are involved, it blows up the family. It really does, you know. And we have very many partners. They don't, like women, they don't want their husbands to be carted off to jail. They just want them to stop abusing. Like that's what they want. They want that to stop. And the legal recourse it's a very blunt and kind of awkward tool. But it's better than nothing.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break and then talk about what comes next. Colleen, it's been obviously a considerable undertaking over the last generations to help change this situation of women's rights. What needs still to be done?
Well, I think my goal and the goal of most people is that we want a society where every person feels safe in their own home with their partner, whether it's a woman or a man or a child, that homes are places of safety and support, and that's what the goal is. So there's lots that we still need to do. I think we've done a pretty good job of moving these issues more into the openness and shedding the light on the issue. I think we've done a lot of work on recognizing that there's enormous harm done when there's abuse in a home. So let's just say if children witness abuse in their home, it has the same impact on children as when you physically abuse children yourself. Like child abuse, it is a form of child abuse, witnessing abuse in a family. So, you know, there's a lot of good work that's been done there. And earlier we were talking about the kind of, well, what about men sort of conversation, and how can men be part of that? And I honestly think that where we're headed now is, you know, just increasing a basic comfort level with everybody, men and friends and neighbors. And I've been very involved with a provincial campaign called Neighbors, Friends and Families. These are the people who are closest to families that are really struggling with abuse. Their neighbors, their friends, their co-workers.
Yes.
And all of us need to be able to help, not avoid and silence or pretend or minimize. We need to be in the position to help. We need to be able to say to our friend, are things okay with you?
Yes.
That's the third time you've come in with that awful bruise on your arm. Is there something you need to be talking about, or is there any way I can help? All of us have to be able to do that. When we hear the harassing phone calls come in at our place of work, because it's very common that abusers will harass, it's a form of control, and often if a victim of violence leaves the abusive relationship, that's when the abuse really starts. That actually is the most dangerous time for a victim. And when I first started in the shelter, one of the most common things that would be said when I did public speaking was, well, why don't those women leave? If it's so bad, why do they go back to those guys? And it was, oh, you know, they must be masochistic or something. But we know now, we have all these great statistics. They do a death review every year in Ontario. And the most dangerous time for someone to leave an abusive partner is right after the separation and following a separation, because abuse, it's not really about anything but controlling victims. It's all about controlling victims. And when the victim leaves the abusive relationship, then the person doesn't have control any longer, and their life kind of falls apart, and they can be very dangerous. So what we have to do as a society is recognize that we can change this. We can stop it, we can change it, and we can make sure if it does happen that it doesn't go on for decades before something happens or until someone dies. We can intervene and make a difference.
I think you and I both discovered previous conversation that we're both fans of Patrick Stewart. And,
yes.
So clearly that's now these kinds of things are now being said openly at the highest level.
Well, the other is that there's a lot of men now who are saying, you know what, this is not actually a women's issue at all. Violence against women, violence against children, violence against other men, there's a lot of men doing it.
Right.
And there's a lot of men stepping up now and saying, we need to be able to change this and stop this. And that in the past wasn't the way it was. It was a lot of men felt attacked. If I talked to them about violence against women, they often felt attacked, and somehow I thought all men were violent. So I said, you know, in the early days, I got called a man-hater about twice a day. And it has nothing to do with hating men. It has everything to do with getting men to engage, to kind of stop violence where they see it. And because most men aren't violent. So that's, I think, where we're headed, seeing this as it's not a women's issue, it's a societal issue, and we all have a role to play.
And so has Grey County progressed a great deal?
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like
Yeah,
it.
we have a whole range of services now that we never had in the past. A lot of community-based services. So when I started this work, you had to go to a shelter to get help. Well, you know, not many women, we only had a 10-bed shelter, first of all, and second of all, not all women want to, you know, pick up their family, their children, and go and stay and live communally in the middle of the crisis.
Unless you just want advice.
Yeah, so now there's community-based counseling, and we have a sexual assault services now. We never had those in the past.
Let's talk about that. We're getting near the end, and I want to make sure that if there's anybody watching right now who is having issues with violence or with mental health or addiction, or knows somebody who is or you think might be, let's maybe we should talk about where they can go.
Sure. Well, I think really 211 is the best resource. I'm so happy about 211. If anybody's at home and they're worried about their daughter, their son, anybody because of violence, there's signs. See, that's the education program we're doing now. What are the signs of abuse?
Right.
You know, what do we need to be looking for so that we can get help?
So it's a helpline like 911.
Yeah. So 211 is just a place where you can say, I'm really worried about my daughter. It looks like she's in an abusive relationship, where are the services? They will tell you all those numbers. It's just a listing of all the numbers. But the Women's Center here in Owen Sound has a crisis line. You can call anytime, day and night. It's staffed by professionals, and it's free, and you don't have to give them your name or anything if you just need to talk to somebody, and that's 519-371-1600. Okay. And the Women's House over in Kincardine has the same crisis line response, and that's 519-396-9814. So those are the two major services for women. If you're a man who's abusive, or if you're a man who's been sexually assaulted and you're looking for help dealing with that, you can call the men's program, and that's 519-372-2720. And the hospital has services for domestic violence and sexual abuse for both women and men who are victims, and you can contact them at 519-376-2121. So those are the major services, and all of those services will help people find other services that they might need if they have a mental health or addiction issue.
And the hospital can,
I'll refer out. And the good thing is too is that, you know, we've worked hard in our community. All of these services are part of a larger protocol with the police on domestic violence and sexual assault. So we're all kind of connected with this protocol. So we work together in the community, which is also a very big change from when I started.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that it's such a dreadful thing, but it's good that good progress is being made. And, and I'm sure that a lot involved watching will join me in extending our thanks to you for
well, it's not me, it's there's a whole
for you and everybody involved for your efforts.
Yeah, I feel very privileged to have been part of this history of making women's lives and children's lives safer. Yeah.
Much obliged. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Right.
Yeah.